Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, you've given us a ton to think about with all this material on habits. Looks like the audiobook of James Clear's Atomic Habits from that Empower Your Mind YouTube channel, I think I'm pronouncing that right, is going to be our main focus.
You got it. I think with Clear's work, we've got a solid base to work from here.
Hmm.
Our goal is to really boil down these essential principles of how habits form, how they change, and how you can use them to make real changes in your life. Like, how can we cut through all the fluff and get to the heart of what matters for personal growth?
So, we're going deep on this idea of atomic habits, those super small, almost invisible changes that over time can lead to some pretty huge results. I always like to think of it like a plane. If it changes course just a tiny bit at takeoff, just a few degrees, it could end up hundreds of miles off course by the time it lands. It's that power of seemingly insignificant changes adding up over the long haul.
What's really interesting is that these small adjustments, these everyday habits, aren't just about ending up in a different place. They actually kind of reshape the entire journey. Success isn't this big event. It's the result of all those daily practices. Like Clickwell points out, what we see right now is often just a delayed reflection of those habits.
Yeah.
Your finances today. That's the sum total of all your financial habits, good or bad. Your weight. It's a lagging indicator of your eating patterns, the knowledge you have. That comes from consistent learning.
It's easy to get so fixated on the scoreboard that we forget to pay attention to the plays we're running. Clay makes a good point about that. He contrasts a millionaire who's spending more than they earn. They look successful now, but it can't last forever.
Right. And then you've got someone struggling financially today, but they're putting away even a small amount each month. Their present situation doesn't tell the whole story because their habits are laying the foundation for something different down the road. It all comes down to understanding which direction your habits are taking you.
And that's where time becomes this incredible force multiplier, right? Clear talks about how time just magnifies the difference between good and bad habits. Good habits become these powerful allies, their benefits compounding, while bad habits, they're like a constant weight holding you back.
They're a double-edged sword for sure. This brings us to the idea of compounding marginal gains. Just a 1% improvement every day. It might not seem like much in the moment, but over time, those little wins really stack up. Like if you get just one more productive task done each day, that doesn't seem like much. But over a year, that's a ton of extra output.
It's like what Warren Buffett says about knowledge. It's like compound interest. Every new thing you learn opens up new ways of thinking, new connections, and it's not limited to personal productivity. Think about small, consistent acts of kindness in relationships. They build trust and support over time.
For sure. But we've also got to recognize the flip side, the compounding of negative outcomes. Things like stress, that constant negative self-talk or resentment that builds up in relationships, these small things, they can accumulate and cause serious problems over time.
It makes you realize that so many of the big problems we face often start with these tiny, repeated actions or inactions. Clear even talks about how things like social unrest can be the result of a long series of unresolved issues, those little frustrations that keep building until things boil over.
Absolutely. So yeah, these tiny habits have a lot of power, but Clear also makes a really important distinction between what we want to achieve and how we go about it. This is where goals versus systems comes in.
That was a big aha moment for me, honestly. We're always told to set goals, but Clear really emphasizes the importance of focusing on systems instead. What's the difference between the two?
Well, goals are about the results you want to achieve, losing weight, writing a book, starting a business, whatever. Systems are the processes you put in place to get there, like your diet and exercise plan, your writing schedule, or your product development strategy. Clear mentions Scott Adams, who focuses on systems because goals are kind of fleeting.
Right. Like a coach's goal is to win a championship. But their system is all about daily practice routines, player development strategies, the team culture they create, or an entrepreneur wants to hit $1 million valuation. But their system is focused on customer acquisition, product iteration, and team management.
Now, here's a thought-provoking question that Clear asks. If you totally forgot about your goals and just focused on perfecting your systems, would you still be successful? Imagine a musician who dedicates themselves to practice every single day, honing their craft without obsessing over a specific concert or award. That consistency would probably lead to opportunities and recognition, wouldn't it?
It's that idea that if you just focus on getting a little bit better every day, the results will follow. Kind of like Bill Walsh said, focus on the process and the score will take care of itself. Maybe we should be spending more energy designing those effective systems rather than just fixating on the end goal.
That's the key takeaway. Goals can provide a direction, but systems are the engine that drives progress. And Clear points out this flaw in overemphasizing goals. Winners and losers often have the same goals, right? Olympic athletes all want that gold medal. Job applicants all want that same position. The goal itself doesn't set anyone apart.
That British cycling team example really illustrates this. Their big goal was to win the Tour de France. But their breakthrough came when they shifted their focus to making all these tiny improvements, from the aerodynamics of their bikes to the riders' recovery routines. It's all about the system.
Exactly. Goals can also be kind of a temporary fix. You achieve the goal, then what? You often see a drop in motivation, and those old habits can creep back in. The long game is about continuous improvement, which means focusing on sustainable systems. The goal might be winning the game, but the system is about making sure you can keep playing and keep improving.
This leads to a powerful statement. You do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems. It's kind of freeing, isn't it? If you're struggling to make a change, maybe it's not about willpower, but about needing a better system.
Exactly. It reframes the whole challenge from a personal failing into a design problem, which feels much more manageable.
Okay, so we're starting to see the importance of those small, consistent actions and the power of the systems behind them. Then Clear introduces this third layer, something even deeper: identity-based habits. This feels like where lasting change really happens. Can you break that down for us?
This is where we move beyond what you do and how you do it to who you believe you are. Clear talks about 3 levels of change: outcomes, which are the results you want; processes, the systems you put in place; and identity, which is all about your fundamental beliefs about yourself. He argues that for truly lasting change, you got to focus on identity, on becoming the type of person who naturally does the things you want to do.
The example he uses about someone trying to quit smoking is so perfect. Saying, "I'm trying to quit smoking," implies it's a struggle. But saying, "I'm not a smoker," signifies a shift in how you see yourself.
Right. Most people start with outcomes. They want to lose weight, for example. Then maybe they think about actions like diet and exercise. But they forget about the underlying beliefs driving their behavior. That old identity can totally sabotage new goals. As Clear says, behind every system of actions is a system of beliefs.
It's like trying to build a house on a shaky foundation. You can put up the walls, but it won't stand for long. Clear says that actions that go against your self-identity are not going to last. If you see yourself as someone who's bad with money, sticking to a budget will always be a struggle, even if you know you should be saving.
Or if you believe you're not a healthy person, trying to exercise and eat right will feel like this constant battle. You'll be fighting against your own self-image. There's a disconnect there.
And then Clear shares that story about Brian Clark and his nail biting. It's such a simple story, but it really makes you think. He tried for years to stop, but it wasn't until he started getting manicures that the habit finally broke.
The key there is that identity shift. Getting manicures wasn't just about having nice nails. It was about seeing himself differently as someone who took care of his appearance. Biting his nails didn't fit with that new self-image.
So it's not just about doing different things, it's about becoming a different person. Motivation can get you started, but it's that new identity that makes it stick.
I love that line from Clear. The goal is not to read a book. The goal is to become a reader.
That's it. Our behaviors often just reflect our underlying identity, whether we realize it or not. Once you believe you're a certain type of person, a creative person, a disciplined person, an athlete, you're way more likely to act in a way that's consistent with that belief.
But that identity can also hold you back, can't it? Those ingrained beliefs about yourself, like, I'm just not good at that, or that's just not who I am, they can become these self-imposed limitations. Definitely. A strong sense of identity can push you forward, but those rigid beliefs can also blind you to new possibilities. Real growth often means challenging those assumptions about yourself.
So if we want to shift our habits at this deep identity level, how do we actually do that? Clear gives a pretty simple 2-step process.
It is simple. First, you decide who you want to be. What are the values and qualities you want to embody? Then prove it to yourself with small wins. It's all about taking those consistent actions that reinforce who you're becoming.
Every action is like a vote for the person you want to be. If you want to be a writer, writing even a few sentences each day casts a vote for that identity. If you want to be healthier, choosing a piece of fruit over a cookie is a vote for that new self.
It's about building evidence for that desired identity through consistent action.
After laying all of this groundwork, Clear presents his big framework for understanding and changing habits, the 4 laws of behavior change. He also calls it the habit loop. Can you walk us through these 4 laws?
Sure. Clear says that all habits, good or bad, follow this same four-stage pattern: cue, craving, response, and reward. If you understand this loop, you can start to shape your habits more consciously.
Let's break it down. The first law is make it obvious, and this all starts with the cue. What exactly is a cue in the context of habits?
The cue is like the trigger. It's a piece of information that tells your brain to start a behavior. It signals that there's a potential reward. Think about way back when, in our evolutionary history. Cues were often about survival, spotting berries, hearing a predator. Nowadays, our cues are things like notifications on our phones or the TV remote just sitting there.
So our brains are constantly searching our environment for these cues that have been linked with rewards in the past.
Exactly. That cue then leads to the second stage,
Hmm.
the craving. What's the connection between the cue and the craving?
The craving is like the engine that drives the habit. It's the desire to change your internal state. Clear points out that we don't actually crave the habit itself, but the way we expect it to make us feel.
That's important. Someone scrolling on their phone isn't craving the act of scrolling. They're craving the feeling of connection or distraction it gives them. You might not crave going to the gym, but you crave the feeling of being energized afterward.
And the same cue can spark totally different cravings in different people, right? Like Claire's example of someone with an alcohol addiction seeing a bottle of whiskey. That triggers an intense craving for them. But for someone who doesn't drink, it's just a bottle.
That's it. Our past experiences shape how we interpret those cues and what they make us crave.
Okay, so we've got the cue and then the craving. What happens next in this loop?
The third stage is the response, the actual habit you perform. It could be a physical action like going for a run or a mental one like checking social media. Whether you respond depends on a few things: how motivated you are at that moment, how much effort it takes to do the behavior, and of course, whether you're actually able to do it.
That makes sense. If the response requires more effort than you're willing to put in, you're probably not going to do it. And finally, we reach the fourth stage, the reward. What does the reward do in this whole process?
The reward is the payoff, the thing that satisfies that craving. And more importantly, it's what tells your brain that this particular action is worth remembering and repeating. It closes that feedback loop.
So by understanding these four pieces, cue, craving, response, reward, we can start to figure out how all these habits work. And that gives us the power to break bad habits and build good ones.
Exactly. When you understand the mechanics of each stage, you can start to design your environment and your behaviors more intentionally to support the changes you want to make.
Let's dig a little deeper into that first law. Make it obvious. Clear gives some great examples of how our brains are always picking up on these tiny cues, often without us even knowing it.
It's pretty amazing how our brains can learn these complex patterns and make predictions based on just little bits of information. Like that story about the paramedic who could tell her father-in-law was having a heart attack just by looking at him, even though she couldn't explain what she was seeing.
And there are so many other examples. You have military analysts who can tell the difference between enemy and friendly aircraft on radar, even when they look almost identical. Museum curators can spot fake artwork, even if it's incredibly well done.
And think about radiologists. After years of training, they can look at a brain scan and see the subtle signs of a future stroke, even before there are any symptoms. Our brains are constantly taking in all this sensory data and making connections.
But the downside, as Clear points out, is that habits can become so automatic that we slip back into old patterns without even realizing what's happening. He talks about that funny example of a store employee who was so used to shredding expired gift cards that she accidentally shredded a customer's perfectly good credit card.
Or that former kindergarten teacher who, years later, was still asking adults if they washed their hands after using the restroom. Those behaviors get wired in deep.
Which really highlights how important it is to become aware of those unconscious habits if you want to change them. Like Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. So how do we start bringing those automatic behaviors to light?
Clear suggests starting with a habit scorecard.
Yeah.
Basically, you list out all your daily habits from the moment you wake up to when you go to bed. Then you label each one as positive, negative, or neutral. The key is to just observe what you actually do without judging yourself.
It's like taking stock of all your behaviors. Then there's that point and calling technique that Japanese railway workers use. That seems like a cool way to increase awareness.
Yeah, before they do something important, like checking a signal, they actually point at it and say out loud what it is. Signal is green. That simple act of physically engaging with the cue and saying what they're going to do really helps them focus and avoid mistakes.
It forces them to pay attention to something that could easily become routine. So how do we use that increased awareness to make good habits more obvious? Clear introduces implementation intentions.
That's a great strategy for getting yourself to actually follow through on your intentions. It's a simple formula. I will behavior at time and location. When you specify the when and where, the cue becomes much clearer and harder to miss.
So instead of a vague goal like I want to exercise more, you'd say, I will go for a 30-minute walk at 7 a.m. in the park. Being that specific makes it more likely to happen. And then there's habit stacking.
Habit stacking is all about connecting a new habit you want to build to an existing habit you already do regularly.
Mm.
The formula is, after current habit, I will new habit. You're basically using the momentum of your current routine to create a new one.
It's like a chain reaction of good behavior. Clear's examples are things like, after I make my coffee, I will meditate for 1 minute. Or after I take off my work shoes, I will change into my workout clothes.
Or, after I sit down for dinner, I will say one thing I'm grateful for. It's kind of like a positive version of that Diderot effect, the idea that getting one new thing often leads to a desire for other related things. Here, a good habit triggers another one.
And it's important to pick the right anchor habit, right? It needs to be something you already do reliably and ideally with the same frequency as the new habit you want to build. Clear says to really think about your daily routines and find those strong anchors.
Definitely. And be specific about linking the two habits. That makes a big difference. Now, something else that plays a big role in making cues obvious is our environment. We often don't realize how much it influences us.
Right, we develop these strong mental connections between certain habits and certain places. Your couch might be linked to watching TV, the kitchen to eating, your desk to working, and those connections can be different for everyone.
That's where understanding context comes in. Clear mentions a study where insomniacs were told to only use their bed for sleeping. If they couldn't fall asleep, they had to get out of bed and only go back when they were actually tired. Eventually, their brains started to associate the bed with sleep much more strongly.
That's interesting. So, a powerful strategy for changing habits could be to change your environment. When you're in a new place, you don't have all those same cues triggering old habits. That creates space for new behaviors to emerge.
Exactly. It disrupts those automatic connections and makes it easier to establish new routines. If you can't change your whole environment, Clear suggests redesigning your current one, creating separate spaces for different activities.
The one space, one use idea, like having a dedicated office separate from where you relax, I've definitely noticed that when those lines blur, it's harder to focus or unwind.
And Clear also warns against mixing the contexts of different habits. He points out that things like smartphones, while being super useful, can actually be bad for building focused habits because they have so many different cues.
You might pick up your phone to check your email, but then see a notification and get sucked into social media. So it's about being intentional, about dividing your spaces and using specific devices for specific things.
That's it. Now, by consciously making those good habits obvious, using implementation intentions, habit stacking, and designing our environment, we've addressed the first law. Let's move on to the second. Make it attractive.
This one's all about cravings, the driving force behind habits. Clear says that the more appealing a habit is, the stronger the craving will be, and the more likely we are to do it. And dopamine plays a big role here.
What's fascinating is that dopamine, the feel-good chemical, isn't just released when we actually get a reward, it's also released when we anticipate a reward. That anticipation is what fuels our motivation. So making cues for good habits predict positive feelings is really important.
And that brings us to this clever strategy, temptation bundling. This one seems really practical.
Temptation bundling is basically pairing something you want to do with something you need to do. For example, only letting yourself watch your favorite show while you're on the treadmill.
So you're making that need to do habit more appealing by linking it with something enjoyable. You're building in a reward system.
Exactly. Clear also points out how much social influence shapes our habits. We're social creatures, and we tend to copy the habits of those around us, particularly these three groups: our close friends and family, the wider community, and people we see as successful or influential.
So our inner circle, the general trends in society and those we look up to, it makes sense that we'd gravitate toward behaviors that are common or even admired by these groups.
And proximity plays a big role, both physical and social. We're more likely to pick up habits from people we spend a lot of time with, whether it's in person or online.
Like the herd mentality, if everyone you know is doing something, it feels more appealing and normal. Clear talks about Solomon Asch's conformity experiments, which showed how powerful social pressure can be.
It can definitely be a double-edged sword. Bad habits can become normalized and seem more attractive if they're all around you. But you can also use this to your advantage by finding communities where the habits you want are the norm.
And then there's that human tendency to imitate successful people. Their habits often become something we aspire to.
Right. So the second law, make it attractive, is about understanding these motivations, the anticipation of reward, the influence of social dynamics, and using them to make good habits more appealing.
Now, when Clear talks about putting this second law into practice, he brings up supernormal stimuli. This was a really interesting way to understand why some unhealthy habits are so hard to resist.
Supernormal stimuli are basically exaggerated versions of things that trigger strong responses in our brains, like highly processed foods. They're packed with salt, sugar, and fat, way more than you'd find naturally. They kind of hijack our reward systems.
They're designed to be irresistible to our primal cravings. And Clear also points out that a lot of our early habits are formed just by mimicking others because we have this innate desire to fit in. Social norms act as these invisible rules that guide our behavior.
And he emphasizes again how important it is to intentionally imitate the habits of those three groups, the close, the many, and the powerful. For your close circle, it's about spending time with people who already have the habits you want.
For the many, it's about finding communities where your desired habits are normal. Belonging to a group can really keep you motivated.
And for the powerful, it's about finding people who have achieved what you want and learning from them. Now, Clear also talks about flipping this law around. Make it unattractive. How can we use this to break bad habits?
This means getting to the root of those bad habits. Oftentimes, the surface level craving, like wanting a cigarette, actually comes from a deeper need, like wanting to relieve stress or feel connected.
Habits are basically our modern ways of trying to satisfy ancient desires. The key is to figure out what need that bad habit is trying to fulfill, and then find a healthier way to meet that need.
Because cravings are all about feelings. A cue triggers a prediction, and that leads to a feeling, the craving. Cravings tell us that something's missing and push us to change our internal state.
Clear says we can actually train our brains to enjoy those tough but beneficial habits by linking them to positive experiences. Even just changing your language from I have to I get to can make a difference. Focus on the benefits of the habit, not the drawbacks. See exercise as a way to build skills and energy, saving money as a path to freedom and security.
That's a powerful idea, just shifting your perspective to change your emotional connection to those should-do habits and make them more like want-to-do habits.
Exactly. By consciously making good habits obvious and attractive, we've covered the first two laws. Next time, we'll dive into the final two. Make it easy and make it satisfying, which are just as important for building lasting habits.
So, to quickly recap, we've explored the huge impact of small habits and how they compound over time. We've talked about the difference between goals and systems and how focusing on systems can be more effective. And we went deep on the idea of identity-based habits and how changing your self-image is crucial for real change.
We then broke down the habit loop cue, craving, response, reward, the framework for understanding how all habits work. We spent time on the first law, make it obvious, talking about strategies like the habit scorecard, implementation intentions, habit stacking, and the role of our environment.
And finally, we unpacked the second law, make it attractive, looking at the influence of dopamine, temptation bundling, the power of social norms, and those supernormal stimuli. We also touched on the idea of making bad habits unattractive and understanding the deeper needs behind our cravings.
With all this knowledge, we can start to look at our everyday routines with a fresh perspective and make choices that help us grow. Next time, we'll focus on making those good habits easy to do and more rewarding to keep up.
Join us as we continue to unlock the secrets of atomic habits and equip you with practical strategies to create the life you want, one small step at a time.